You know, it's fascinating to think that our workplace and our approach to DEI largely hasn't changed following about immediately post World War II. But then you look at who our workforce is now, it's 47% female, and 49% of millennial workers, who make up the biggest share of the workforce, are people of color. And so if you're not hearing from those people, you are leaving an immense amount of good ideas on the table, and you're just leaving money on the table. And so, you know, in just an increasingly competitive environment, that's how you get your competitive advantage. I mean, they're already there. You've already done the work to bring them to the workplace. And so, you know, it can be that you're looking at that from a product design lens, that you just want to create products that appeal to a wider audience. It can be that you're looking at this from a risk mitigation perspective. You know, we're seeing that organizations that have more diverse leadership bounce back more quickly following recessions. And, you know, yeah, we see from an innovation lens, it's really cool to see tech companies that employ more inclusive strategies end up producing more patents. So they just end up creating more, and it has a bigger impact on who their consumer base is, you know, and how they're perceived, how other people perceive their brand.
Yeah, this just sounds like a win all around to make forward progress, to recognize for companies that are at the starting line that that's in fact where they are, and that there's a lot of distance that can be traveled from there. In your TED Talk, you described the the destination point of true gender equity being reached in a distant future. Are there companies that are moving that that finish line or that new state line closer, faster than others? And are there any examples of those that are actually close, you know, in near term now, given the value and benefits of gender equity?
Patagonia, we really look at Patagonia as a great leader in this space. They've always been a player that just says, okay, show us the research on what is going to be the best for our underrepresented employees, and we'll do that thing. And so, you know, they were kind of one of the first to do that with paid leave. They've had great flex work policies, and it shows. So they report just having close to zero attrition of their employees. They're just not losing anyone because people are happy and they want to stay. Salesforce, Mark Benioff has done, I want to say he's not just done a lot of work, he's been very vocal about the work they're doing in a way that goes beyond PR. So we really look to them as a leader as well, where, you know, he's talked about this publicly, that he realized one day they've never done a true pay gap audit in their company. They did one, they found gaps, and then he just said, we'll close them, like pay the people more, do it. He went completely public about this and told everyone we have pay gaps instead of doing this like hush hush, keep it behind the scenes. So he set a great example for other businesses. And then, you know, the next step he took that we really find to be the most important is that then he said, let's look at the systemic factors that cause this pay gap in the first place, which, you know, is what we really look to leaders to do, that people do these pay gap analyses and they treat them like pay gaps happen in a vacuum. And so then they will pay the employees who were making less, speaking in broad strokes, you know, they'll pay them to close that gap, and it's a short-term fix. And so we say, yeah, that's great. Go and close those gaps because those people deserve to be paid more. But in 3 years, you're going to have a pay gap again. You know, that problem is going to come right back and it's going to resurface. So, you know, it's just a symptom of something else that's really underlying. And then, you know, locally in Seattle, EVIA Events is one of our recently certified organizations. You're familiar with them. I think they actually did some production work with TED. They are doing great work in this space, especially just because they center it on such a consistent basis that, you know, yes, they put these policies in place, like they do blind resume reviews now. They standardize their performance evaluation practices. They've really structured their mentorship so that everyone has equal access to senior leaders. And then, you know, from what I see in their blogs and what I hear from their employees, it's like they talk about equity and inclusion every week. You know, it's not just something where like they give water bottles to women on International Women's Day and make a statement that they care. They really do put in the work, and it's shown in their products that they offer, that, you know, they're more inclusive in terms of multiple languages being offered in their captions for, you know, the digital products that they provide, and really they design everything they do with an equity lens. So that's been super cool to see. And then, yeah, I look at, you know, it's hard not to just focus on organizations that we've certified, but NIA Impact Capital is another great one. They were our first one, and they are an impact investment firm. And so the interesting thing about them is that they started, I mean, they were founded with a gender lens. Their founder said, let's have a, you know, gender forward investment portfolio. So it's the thing that they cared about, and they still found that they had a lot of work to do, you know, when we assessed them. You know, it was this great moment for them where, I mean, they literally were created to further the purpose of gender equity, and they still found, when it came to evaluating their own practices and processes, that they had changes to make. And, you know, similar to Mark Benioff, they were very public about them. They said, these are what our gaps were, and this is what we did to change them. And, you know, I don't think they've lost an employee since. You know, I think employees are there and engaged and just have this sense of pride in what they do.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, it almost sounds like drive towards business success is a great DE&I driver, right? I mean, everything that you're mentioning are specific, research-based, practical. They each and collectively show positive business results and employee satisfaction improvement results. So it sounds like it's, you know, all just across the board beneficial for companies, and you know, producing powerful results at all levels. Taking it back to the you know, the fact that there is this mix of unconscious bias plus organizational inertia and historical systemic dynamics in place. There may be some programs that that make claims to do a significant change in DE&I, but only kind of really scratch the surface. How can a company distinguish between something that sort of is a Band-Aid on something that needs a more significant overhaul?
That's a great question. So we, you know, whether or not you're going to end up working with Jen, we say, you know, if you're an employer, an employee, a consumer who wants to spend money in alignment with your values, ask what the criteria are behind, you know, whether they're a consultancy or a nonprofit organization or a best workplaces to work list. Ask what the criteria are. Ask what they're measuring. What gets measured matters, you know, and it ends up driving the focus in an organization. So if an outside consultancy comes in and says, you just need to focus on representation, that's a problem if that is their only set of criteria. Because, you know, if you're a giant organization like Amazon, you can afford to essentially rehire and rehire and rehire, so representation numbers look great, but they may be bringing people into the organization that they're not really ready to include, you know, where they've put up new window dressing, but they haven't fixed the house. And so, you know, we put all of our criteria online for a reason. You know, we kind of joke that we Tesla'd it, like we put it out there and we say, even if you don't work with us, feel free to use these. Design your organization to be equity centered. But those are also meant to act as a kind of checklist for people to look at, so that, you know, if you're interviewing for a job, you know, you can ask, how have you standardized your performance evaluation practices? How do you ensure, you know, women and minorities get equal access to professional development opportunities here? And there are ways that they should and shouldn't be doing those things. You know, one of the things that we look at with a really critical eye are other lists, because it's why we created what we're doing. And so frankly, you know, I sit in conversation after conversation with potential certification candidates that say, you know, wow, you have actionable, insightful recommendations, but we'd have to do the work. And frankly, we look at these guys over here and we can write them a check for $10,000, make a public statement that we're committed to equity, and we're good. And so, you know, we're sorry, but we're going with that approach. And I understand why, But it does make it so that those of us who are, working with organizations to make authentic change are up against even bigger barriers, and it makes it that much more confusing for women and people of color to assess where they're really going to be appreciated, and who's going to honor their ambition. So we ask everyone, look for criteria. And if you can't find any, that's a red flag. If you can't find any, that probably means that a consultancy went in and said, yes, you're great, you're doing everything right. You can check the box and tell your employees they have nothing to complain about, and go on your way. So if they don't have criteria, that's a problem.
So it is critical that organizations recognize the necessity of actually doing some of the work. I'm struck by how the way that work gets recognized and even how it gets implemented can look really differently. It can seem like an incredible amount of work, but when at the end of the day, it might come down to things like having an extra minute during a meeting to give people a chance to respond. That's the kind of work, like, it's just good for your relationship work, right? It may seem hard at first, but once you do it, you see the benefits right away. Improved interactivity, improved closeness, improved cross-pollination of ideas, improved engagement, and improved energy. Is that also true more broadly, do you think, that organizations see the benefits in that kind of a light? Does that help become a motivator, if it is, that helps them get over some of the hurdles of the work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, there's an inertia, right? There's an inertia to overcome. And I think what we see is once they take the first step, they find out it's not that bad. Like, it's really not the nightmare situation that a lot of people envision. In fact, it's usually just really positive and exciting. And employees are happy that it's finally happening and they've finally been heard. It doesn't turn into this place where it's like, oh, the men are going to lose their jobs. Like, that really is not the outcome. It's that the people who are there are finally being seen. And so, I think whether or not it's a motivator, it's something that organizations eventually experience. And it's probably the most common piece of feedback we get is just, this isn't what we thought it was going to be. We're really grateful that we did it. But it is that first step that's the hardest. It's like lacing up the running shoes is the hardest part, right? To be cliche. And for a lot of them, to be completely honest, they come to us because they've had a discrimination complaint or they've had something bad happen that finally is kind of their wake-up call, where they realize that, they really do need to do something different. And then they find out that this really is about changing systems. They find out that it's about changing some processes, and a lot of them, they're just plug and play. It's like you change them once and you're set to go. So it's really more efficient than doing like trainings every year and just trying to be better people. It shifts that onus from the employee to the organization in a way where we hope people don't actually have to constantly think about whether or not they're incidentally being biased, because these processes should protect against it, even if they're being biased.
So in a way, if we are not consciously including, we're probably unconsciously excluding. We're coming to the end of our time together now. I'm wondering if you have any closing thoughts or call to action or final takeaway that you'd like to leave us with, perhaps a broad statement that could apply to lots of different people, whether they're business leaders or employees.
I like that. The thing that you just said is great. I think some of the feedback we hear a lot of times that's a little bit sad. People think, okay, well, if we have to bring in, a lot more underrepresented people, does that mean that we have to lower our standards? Which is an unfortunate way of thinking about it. And, one of the things I bring up, like, it's not that you're not having to bring in anyone who's not qualified. It's that you're finally bringing in everyone who's qualified. That you've been leaving people out unintentionally by not including them via your processes. I think just in the times that we're in, and I think this will will probably stay true. A lot of organizations, and in the wake of Me Too, and now, as Black Lives Matter really gains a lot of momentum, organizations are revisiting their diversity numbers for the first time in years, and they're finding out that they haven't budged, and they're saying, how did this happen? How could this be? And, kind of two recommendations I would just make for them is, this time around, you have this renewed energy, and that is fantastic. Don't stop at a recruiting strategy. If an organization comes to us for recruiting, I will insist that they need a retention, equity, and inclusion strategy, because it's not fair to bring underrepresented people into organizations that aren't ready for them. And the other one, I think if there was like a slogan I could drop on organizations, it would just be that DEI is not your company kickball team. So please get experts to work with you if you don't have anyone in-house. We see a lot of companies treat diversity, equity, and inclusion like this fun extracurricular, like kickball, where they're like, hey, we've decided to start a DEI task force. Whoever is interested, show up Wednesday with your best ideas. And would you do this with accounting? Would you do this with operations or any other business critical function? No. So when we see companies do that, when they take the kickball approach, this is what happens: is a lot of Googling occurs, which leads to like your cached algorithms bringing you to links that make you feel comfortable. And then there's a lot of infighting about what people should do. And then everyone stares at the one person of color or woman in the room and says, well, what do you think? And that person's in a really risky position at that point. And they can bear, a huge amount of risk in being honest with people. So we really just ask organizations, please call an expert, ask what their criteria are to actually help you. Treat DEI like any other critical business function, and you'll see huge success for both social factors and financial.
Thank you, Sarah. That is just wonderful to see it laid out and clearly expressed the way you do. And here's to a near-term future, and hopefully a broad, wide, deep future where everyone is deeply, meaningfully included in every aspect of the work, and we bring everyone's contributions to bear against the business critical functions that we all want to deliver on. Sarah, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you, Phil. I appreciate it.